Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really diving headfirst into the world of psychedelics. It's fascinating, complex, and changing fast.
It really is. We'll be looking at everything from, ancient history right up to the latest science and legal shifts.
And we know you want the full picture, but efficiently. So that's the plan for this deep dive, a solid overview.
Exactly. We've pulled together scientific studies, news reports, investor surveys, policy trackers. Quite a mix.
Our mission, then, is to sort through all that and pull out the key insights. What's really going on with research, therapy, investment, the law.
That's the goal. Let's get into it.
Okay, so maybe the best place to start is history. Because it's easy to think this all started in the, mid-20th century, but the sources say otherwise.
Oh, absolutely. The history is, incredibly long. We're talking millennia of use in indigenous cultures.
Right, across different continents, too.
Precisely. Things often called spirit medicines. They were central to religious worship, healing rituals, community building, even exploring consciousness itself.
Like the rituals mentioned in Africa and the Americas.
Yes, exactly, those kinds of examples. It really highlights how these substances were deeply woven into the fabric of some societies, something modern research is just, starting to grapple with therapeutically.
It's kind of mind-boggling, that timeline. I saw a mention of the ancient Greeks and Romans maybe using something called kykeon.
Yeah, the kykeon brew in rites. It suggests this connection goes way back, even in Western roots, and possibly even further.
Further back.
Well, there are hints, archaeological suggestions of psychoactive mushroom use, maybe even back to the Ice Age in the Americas.
Wow.
But we have clearer evidence later in Mesoamerica. Pollen, art, even codices like the Codex Vindobonensis Mexicanus I.
Yeah.
They depict sacred mushroom use.
So mushrooms and also cacti like peyote and San Pedro, those date back thousands of years too, right?
Correct. Thousands of years. It wasn't fringe, it was embedded.
I was struck by the description of those 16th century Aztec rituals with psilocybin mushrooms, followed by something that sounded almost like group therapy.
Bernardino de Sahagún's records, yeah. It's fascinating. People discussing their experiences afterwards. It really shows that deep human need for processing these kinds of experiences.
And the context was so different, wasn't it? The sources contrast that community focus, that connection with nature and spirit.
With the more individualistic way they're often approached in the West now. Yeah, that's a key point.
Which brings up that issue of appropriation.
A really crucial point. The modern boom draws so much from indigenous knowledge, but who's benefiting financially? Often not the original keepers of that knowledge. There's a real disparity.
That's definitely something to keep in mind as we talk about this.
Yeah.
The psychedelic renaissance, as one source called it.
Right. This renewed focus on therapy, on spiritual potential.
So let's shift gears. What does this history mean for today's science and medicine? Where's the research heading?
Well, this is where things get really active. There's huge scientific interest now in the potential antidepressant, anxiolytic, anti-anxiety and anti-addictive effects.
And the results seem pretty promising.
Very promising in many cases. Take psilocybin, the compound, in magic mushrooms. Studies are showing it can significantly reduce depression and anxiety.
Not just general depression, but tough cases too.
Exactly. Treatment-resistant depression, major depressive disorder, even the anxiety people face with a cancer diagnosis, end-of-life anxiety.
That's significant.
And it's not just mood. There's also positive data emerging for addiction.
Ah, right. I remember seeing that. Alcohol and tobacco.
Yes, psilocybin shows promise for both alcohol and tobacco dependence. And if you look at LSD, older research, plus some new interest, points towards potential for alcohol use disorder and anxiety in life-threatening illness.
And ayahuasca. That's another one that comes up often.
You're right, the Amazonian brew. Research suggests it can reduce panic, hopelessness, depression, anxiety, even suicidality, especially in treatment-resistant cases.
What seems really striking across these is, two things. The speed of action and how long the effects might last.
That's a major point of excitement, yes. Often just one or a few doses can lead to rapid and seemingly enduring effects. And generally, in clinical settings, the safety profiles look pretty good.
That idea of a fast-acting, long-lasting treatment is, it's huge for psychiatry. Now, MDMA is a bit different, isn't it?
It is. It's often called an entactogen rather than a classic hallucinogen. It works differently, boosting feelings of empathy, emotional openness.
And the research there is focused on
Social anxiety in autistic adults, end-of-life anxiety. But the big one is PTSD. It's quite far along in development for PTSD treatment.
You got that breakthrough therapy status from the FDA, right?
Right, along with psilocybin.
Correct. That designation means the FDA sees potential for a substantial improvement over existing therapies, which can speed things up. For PTSD, it seems to help people process traumatic memories without being overwhelmed.
So we could be looking at genuinely new kinds of treatments, maybe even developing new drugs based on these compounds. That's definitely a possibility being explored, developing novel molecules, maybe even preventative treatments down the line. It's a really active area.
It makes you think about ketamine, which is already used clinically.
It's a useful comparison. Ketamine is also fast-acting for depression, has some psychedelic effects, but the classic psychedelics don't generally seem to carry the same risks for tolerance or misuse that can sometimes be seen with ketamine.
You mentioned earlier how indigenous use was often communal. Is that social aspect being studied now?
It is, particularly with ayahuasca. Its traditional use is very much about social bonds, community health. Studies have actually measured improvements in mental health markers among people who regularly participate in ayahuasca rituals.
So the setting, the community, it really matters.
It seems to. It highlights how context and social factors can really shape the experience and the outcome, which, contrasts with the stigma that still clings to LSD and psilocybin in some circles because of their recreational use history. Ayahuasca, in its traditional context, often doesn't carry that same baggage.
Okay, this paints a very positive picture overall, but
Yeah.
I know there have been some recent bumps in the road. The FDA decision on MDMA for PTSD was big news.
Yes, that definitely highlights the challenges in moving from research to approved medicine. It's a crucial point in the story.
So what actually happened there?
The FDA issued what's called a complete response letter to Lykos Therapeutics, the company developing MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. Essentially, it means not approved in its current form.
And they asked for more research.
Yes, more research on safety and efficacy. The FDA cited limitations in the data and issues brought up by an advisory committee.
That must have been a huge blow for Lykos, obviously, but also for patients, therapists, veteran groups who were really pushing for this.
Oh, undoubtedly. A lot of disappointment. Lykos says they'll work with the FDA, but if they need another big phase 3 trial, well, that takes significant time and money.
So what does this mean for the other psychedelic therapies in development, like psilocybin and LSD? Does it make the path harder for everyone?
Well, opinions are divided, really. Some see it as a major setback, potentially chilling innovation and investment across the board.
But others see it differently.
Others suggest this might be more specific to Lykos's application, the particular data they submitted. Maybe other companies with different trial designs could still succeed.
And there were questions raised about the Lykos research itself.
Yes, there has been public debate about the research quality, allegations of potential bias or misconduct. How much that weighed on the FDA's decision isn't entirely clear, but it was part of the discussion.
It just shows, doesn't it, that the path to approval is complex, not straightforward at all.
Definitely not.
Okay, let's pivot to the money side of things. What's the mood among investors in the psychedelic space right now?
The Q3 2024 Psychedelic Investor Survey gives us some good clues. One clear shift is who is investing.
How so?
Fewer retail investors seem to be involved now compared to before, but there's an increase in accredited investors, corporate investors, sort of the more established players.
And that affects the size of investments too.
It seems so. Fewer smaller investments, likely because there are fewer retail folks putting in smaller amounts.
But what's the general feeling? Still optimistic.
Generally, yes. The overall sentiment is still positive. Pretty similar, actually, to levels back in late 2022.
But it varies depending on the type of investor.
Exactly. When you break it down, institutional investors are actually more bullish, more optimistic, but retail investors, significantly less optimistic than they were about 2 years ago.
Interesting. And how did that FDA decision on MDMA play into this? Did it shake confidence?
It definitely had an impact. A large group said it didn't change their view, they stayed neutral. But almost 40% said they became more pessimistic after that news.
And only a few became more optimistic.
Only about 15%, yeah. And that increased pessimism was noticeable among the VC, corporate, and more sophisticated investor types.
So where are they seeing the best opportunities now? What parts of the industry look most attractive?
Drug discovery and development is still number one. And setting up clinics, the care delivery side, those remain the top draws.
Any shifts there?
Yeah, growing interest in the manufacturing side, and also in the tech that supports the field. What's least attractive right now, according to the survey, are the state-level markets, like Oregon and Colorado.
Despite the legal changes there.
Despite the legal changes, yeah. Investors seem less keen on those specific state markets for now.
And looking ahead, say, the next year, what are investors planning? What are their main hopes and fears?
It's a bit of a mixed bag on plans, but the larger investors, the ones putting in $250,000 or more, they seem more likely to stick around.
And what's driving their excitement? Still the therapeutic potential.
That's still the main thing, the promise of new treatments. And of course, return on investment is a close second. Interestingly, the excitement about regulatory changes seems to have cooled off a bit compared to 2022.
And less focus on social impact.
A bit less emphasis on that compared to before, yeah. As for concerns, the big ones are still those regulatory and legislative hurdles. Safety and ethics are also high on the list, along with worries about clinical trial results and timelines.
Makes sense. Anything else stand out from this survey?
One interesting point, more investors are reporting having personal experience with psychedelics themselves.
Oh, okay.
But despite all the hurdles, the general belief seems to be that interest in psychedelics is here to stay, that it's sustainable long term.
So cautious optimism seems to be the takeaway on the investment front, even with the recent news. Okay, finally, let's untangle the legal and policy situation. It seems messy.
Messy and evolving is a good way to put it. Internationally, most of the classic psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, DMT, are still Schedule I under the UN Convention.
Which basically means no medical value, high abuse potential, right?
Yeah.
Making research difficult.
Exactly. It creates huge bureaucratic and cost hurdles for researchers. Though it's worth noting the convention does technically allow for scientific and medical use.
But we are seeing countries find ways around that for medical access.
Yes, increasingly. Under compassionate use rules or special access programs. We see this in places like Switzerland, the US, Canada, allowing access for patients with serious conditions who haven't responded to other treatments.
And then there's decriminalization.
Right. A growing number of places are reducing or removing penalties for possessing small amounts for personal use. Portugal is a classic example, but also Chile, Costa Rica, Czechia, Ecuador, Slovenia, Spain, Mexico. The list is growing.
But the rules vary a lot.
Hugely. Decriminalization doesn't mean legal. And the quantity limits, the specifics, they differ everywhere.
What about religious use? That seems to be a distinct legal category in some places.
It is. Ayahuasca churches, for instance, have won legal protection in the U.S. and Canada based on religious freedom arguments. The Union du Vegetal case is a key precedent there.
And peyote used by Native American communities.
That also has longstanding legal protection in the U.S. for bona fide religious ceremonies. And sometimes that protection has extended to non-Native participants in those specific contexts.
We also saw specific legal fights over rescheduling, like the Dr. Agarwal case trying to use the Right to Try Act for psilocybin.
Absolutely. That case highlights the direct challenges to the DEA's scheduling. The DEA rejected the initial attempt, and while early court challenges didn't succeed on procedural grounds, the fight continues, challenging the actual Schedule I classification of psilocybin. That case is still active.
It's so complex. What about somewhere like Canada? It seems like a mix of things are happening there.
Canada's really interesting. Psilocybin is technically illegal, but Health Canada grants individual exemptions for therapeutic use in serious cases. There's the Special Access Program, too.
And spore kits are illegal. And some cacti.
Right. Spore kits and psychoactive cacti like San Pedro aren't prohibited. And ayahuasca churches operate legally. Plus, you have British Columbia decriminalizing small amounts of certain drugs, including some psychedelics, with potential for that to expand.
And even places like Germany or Iceland have nuances.
Yeah, like prosecutorial discretion for small amounts in Germany, or it being
psychedelics
legal
kind of
to
having
just
a moment
pick
right
fresh
now.
magic
I mean,
mushrooms
especially
in
when we're
Iceland,
talking about
even
mental
if
health.
drying
for
or
sure.
selling them isn't.
It
It's
feels
a
like
real
every
patchwork.
week.
So
there's
what's the
a
bottom
new
line
study?
here?
What's needed to move
making
forward?
headlines
Well,
or a new
the
article.
sources really
Absolutely.
stress
And it
the
really
need for
feels like we're
dialogue
kind of on the cusp
between scientists,
of something
health
big.
systems,
Yeah,
the
I think we're in a
public,
really exciting time
politicians,
for research
finding
on
a
this
way
topic.
to integrate
And
these
that's why we
substances
wanted to bring this to you,
responsibly
right?
and
Absolutely.
ethically.
Because I know our
Funding
listeners
is
are
still an
always
issue,
looking to
Yeah.
It is,
really,
especially
like,
because many compounds are off
get a
patent,
grasp
and the
Yeah.
treatment
on
model
what's
is often
actually
just a few
going on.
doses,
For
not
sure.
a
and not
daily
just
pill.
like,
Right.
But
read the
big
headlines.
pharma is showing
The
more
clickbait
interest,
headlines.
which is
Right,
great.
exactly.
Yeah.
And balancing
Yeah.
modern
So
medicine
we've got
with
a
traditional
seriously
knowledge.
in-depth
Crucial. You have these coexisting
piece of research
systems.
Yeah.
dig
Regulation
into
needs
today.
to respect
Yeah, this is a
traditional
big one.
practices
It's
and
a
knowledge,
systematic
not just
review and
steamroll over them.
meta-analysis.
Okay, so wrapping
Oh.
up this deep
called
dive,
Efficacy
we've covered
and
a
Safety
lot
of
of ground.
Psychedelics
So
for the
really
treatment
deep
of
history,
mental disorders.
especially in indigenous
Yes.
cultures.
That title
And
just
then the
rolls right off
surge
the
in
tongue.
scientific research showing
Catchy,
real
right?
Super
therapeutic
catchy.
promise.
I know.
But facing
But
hurdles
this was
like
just
that
published in
recent FDA
Psychiatry
decision
Research
on
Yeah.
MDMA.
in May
The
of
investment scene
which
this
is-
year, cautious but generally positive, watching regulations closely.
Mm. And this incredibly complex, shifting legal landscape, international rules, but national decriminalization trends, religious protections, it's a lot to track.
It really is.
Which brings us to maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Given these ancient roots and this modern resurgence, how do we as societies strike the right balance? How do we manage the potential benefits against the risks as psychedelics potentially become more mainstream in healthcare and culture?
And what ethical guidelines absolutely need to be front and center as this all unfolds?
Yeah, big questions. Definitely more to explore beyond what we could cover today.
Absolutely. Well, this has been incredibly insightful. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dives.